Star Trek V: The Final Frontier is largely considered to be the weakest of the original series films. But was it really that bad? Yes it was. The end. Okay, perhaps I should be a bit more thorough in my appraisal of this fifth film in the Star Trek franchise. Released in 1989, it was directed by William Shatner himself, and he also had some involvement in the story development. Shatner was intrigued by these televangelists who fool people into believing that they have a connection to God. This formed the basis of the character Sybok, originally called Tsar. But in the case of Sybok, it's a little bit different to that, because he's not actually trying to con anyone. He genuinely believes he has a connection to God. He just happens to be wrong. The film's screenplay was written by David Lowery, and the film was produced by Harve Bennett, with Bennett also working on the story. The film took a noticeable step backwards when it came to the visual effects, due to the unavailability of Industrial Light and Magic, who had done the effects for The Wrath of Khan, The Search for Spock, and The Voyage Home. So Bran Ferren's company was hired instead. Generally speaking, I think the effects shots work pretty well, and there's a few that I quite like. They're just not quite up to the standard of ILM. The film tells the story of a charismatic and mysterious Vulcan who possesses emotion and some unique psychic abilities. He's on a quest to find God, specifically the god of the planet Shaka-Ree, which lies beyond the Great Barrier at the center of the galaxy. Incidentally, Sean Connery was originally approached to play the role, and the planet is named in his honor, which is why Shaka-Ree kind of sounds like Sean Connery. But I think Lawrence Luckinbill does a fantastic job in the role, and I couldn't imagine anyone else as Sybok. He brings a Shakespearean quality to it. He brilliantly portrays Sybok's sinister and manipulative qualities, while also balancing them with his naivety and vulnerability by the film's end. And he's also quite likeable. In the beginning of the film, I always find that I dislike Sybok's arrogance, but by the end of the film, I can't help but genuinely have sympathy for him as he meets his tragic end and his dream of meeting God is shattered and he's forced to wake up to his own delusion. He is a truly tragic character and a victim of his own vanity and hubris. Luckinbill is superb in the role, and I think the character of Sybok perfectly personifies and crystallizes something that Robert Meyer Burnett has said many times. Classic Star Trek didn't have villains specifically, it had antagonists. Sybok is not a mustache-twirling villain. He's a deeply flawed and complicated character, driven by obsession and what he believes to be benevolent and righteous personal motivations. Unfortunately, his obsession with his quest blinds him from the consequences of his actions and the fact that he is committing serious crimes and immoral and unethical acts. So, let's get into the plot. The Enterprise crew are on shore leave on Earth after the disastrous shakedown cruise of the new Enterprise NCC-1701A. The ship has been in dry dock for repairs under the supervision of Scotty since the end of the voyage home, which presumably wasn't that long ago, but it's clear that the cast has aged noticeably since that film. The films were made 3 years apart, so I always found it hard to believe that we were expected to accept that this film picks up not long after the events of the voyage home. Anyway, Kirk, Spock and McCoy are camping in Yosemite National Park, and Kirk is climbing the mountain there. It's a light-hearted opening with some nice visuals, some humorous gags. Kirk falls off the mountain, and Spock, with the help of his rocket boots, saves him in a cartoonish fashion. I'm not sure how Spock's positioning here makes any sense in terms of physics, considering his boots aren't facing downwards, they're at an angle, and you can also see the wire holding William Shatner up. I believe this trick was accomplished by filming this shot like this, and suspending Shatner over the rock. Then the shot was rotated afterwards, which might explain why the vegetation appears to be leaning in the direction of the bottom of the mountain, because the bottom of the mountain is actually the floor. It still works pretty well because the lighting, I think, is excellent in this scene. Star Trek V may be a generally weak Trek film, but it does have one of the most iconic and memorable scenes in all of Star Trek, the campfire scene with Kirk, Spock and McCoy, which has some genuinely funny and heartwarming moments. McCoy gives Kirk a bollocking for being so reckless as to climb that mountain, saying that he should have been killed when he fell off it. Kirk addresses his mortality, saying he knew he wouldn't die because McCoy and Spock were with him, and that he's always known he'll die alone, which is very poignant indeed, except for the fact that he would eventually go on to die with a bald Frenchman looking down at him after falling off another mountain. But let's not talk about Star Trek Generations right now. McCoy is amused by the realization that despite all the time spent in space together, getting on each other's nerves, what do they do when shore leave comes along? They spend it together. Other people have families. Kirk says, other people, Bones, not us. The camaraderie and chemistry in the scene works really well, despite the cringe singing of Row, Row, Row Your Boat. I love the playful ribbing between McCoy and Spock. You can tell that these three characters have grown to genuinely care for each other as brothers. On the desolate desert planet of Nimbus III, a Romulan, Vulcan and Klingon ambassador are taken hostage by Sybok and his cult-like followers. This is done as a lure. Sybok wants to bring a Federation starship to Nimbus III. The planet was established as a planet of galactic peace in the neutral zone, but it was ultimately a failed project. Sybok is trying to get off the planet, but needs a starship to do it. The Enterprise crew are forced to end shore leave abruptly when Starfleet orders them to rescue the hostages. Just like in Star Trek the Motion Picture, the Enterprise is setting off on a mission in rough shape, with repairs required to be made en route. But in Star Trek V, it's all kind of played for goofy laughs, as opposed to being life-threateningly serious. In the motion picture, it was broken transporters that could kill you, and a dodgy warp drive imbalance that could create wormholes that could cause the ship to crash into asteroids. In Star Trek V, it's doors that won't open properly, a malfunctioning turbolift voice interface, interference on the view screen, a broken captain's log device. Which makes no sense. Why would this be banjaxed? It's a piece of equipment separate from the ship entirely. The film just couldn't be more different from the motion picture in terms of tone, scope, and production values. The motion picture is a serious, cerebral movie. Star Trek V often plays like a bit of a farce. After watching the hostage tape, Spock looks like he's seen a ghost. As Spock explains to Kirk and McCoy, Sybok was a revolutionary who was banished from Vulcan for pursuing a different path. He believed that the key to self-knowledge was emotion, not logic. Sybok has been receiving visions, which he believes were given to him by God, and the answers he seeks lie only beyond the Great Barrier. So, long story short, Kirk and an away team from the Enterprise mount a rescue mission of the hostages, and everything seems to be going well, until they realize they've walked straight into an ambush, and it turns out the hostages have taken Sybok's side. It turns out Sybok has this kind of brainwashing technique that he can use to influence people and bring them over to his side by showing them their pain or something. They commandeer the shuttlecraft and return to the ship, but only after an emergency crash landing into the shuttle bay because of a near-miss Klingon attack. But more on the Klingons later. After the shuttle crew return to the Enterprise, Kirk briefly fights Sybok, but he's completely overpowered by the much stronger Vulcan. Oh, and during the fight scene, there's a few more wires that are just a little too visible in some shots. Spock disobeys Kirk's direct order to shoot Sybok. At this point in the film, Spock had not revealed the fact that Sybok is his brother. Anyway, Sybok's men take over the Enterprise pretty easily. Pathetic, really. A highly trained Federation crew and their security teams seem to be completely overpowered by a bunch of thugs from a desert planet. I mean, it's just not believable. But anyway, Sybok influences key members of the crew. Kirk, Spock and McCoy are thrown in the brig. And it's in the brig where Spock reveals to Kirk and McCoy an unexpected twist. We get some retconning here. Turns out Spock had a half-brother, which we never knew about. Sybok, a full Vulcan. Like Spock, Sarek was his father, but they had different mothers. Anyway, Kirk, Spock and McCoy are broken out of the brig by Scotty, and they then have to climb a turbolift shaft to get to the communications system in the forward observation lounge. There's a scene where the three of them fly through the turbolift shaft on Spock's rocket boots. Try not to focus too hard on the fact that the number of decks is incorrect. The Enterprise did not have 78 decks. It had something like 23, I believe. Anyway, as I mentioned a moment ago, there's Klingons in this film as well. with a complete side story with this Klingon captain called Kla, who simply wishes to fight Kirk because he represents a more worthy opponent than shooting at space garbage. Kla is played by Todd Bryant, and Vixis, his second-in-command, is played by Spice Williams-Crosby. They both portray their roles very well. It's just that they're really not given much material, and their motivations are just not developed, which is a shame. Although I always felt Kla offered a welcome addition to the overall story, as Klingons are always welcome in Star Trek, it's just that he's not given enough character development, though I still maintain he's certainly memorable as a Klingon. Sybok attempts to also play his mind tricks on Kirk, Spock and McCoy, showing Spock and McCoy past traumas that were a source of their pain, but Kirk refuses to take part, saying he needs his pain. It makes him who he is, and it can't be waved away by the wave of a magic wand. Sybok's abilities seem to work on the weaker-minded people, but amount to little more than sophisticated psychological parlor tricks to those who can see through them. They breach the Great Barrier, which by itself makes little sense that the Enterprise could just make it to the center of the galaxy in a few short hours, but Voyager can't make it to the Alpha Quadrant from the Delta Quadrant in less than 70 years. Go figure. Anyway, Sybok gives the Enterprise back to Kirk with no special conditions. Kirk asks, how does he know he won't just turn them around? But as Sybok rightly says, because he too must know, Shaka-Ree, known to every other culture as a kind of heaven, is a mystery worthy of exploration. Also, just as a quick note, Sybok's mind control over the crew appears to have dissipated, and it's never mentioned again. Go figure. So Kirk, Spock, Bones and Sybok take a shuttlecraft to the planet, and after some walking in the desert, they encounter a large, disembodied head, a man with a white beard, looking like what many people envisage God to be. The creature welcomes them, saying that they are the first to find him. He asks how they arrived, and Sybok explains they took a starship. The creature asks if this starship could carry his wisdom beyond the barrier. Sybok says it could. It will be his chariot. But Kirk is skeptical, wondering in the now immortal one-liner, what does God need with a starship? When asking for proof that this is in fact God, the creature attacks Kirk and then eventually Spock. Sybok is horrified by this and also confused, but he ultimately redeems himself. By sacrificing his life by attacking the creature, he bids a farewell to his brother Spock and apologizes to him. I think Sybok's tragic end, his painful realization and his subsequent act of selflessness is a really solid conclusion to his story arc, and he ultimately dies saving Kirk, Spock and McCoy by buying them enough time to escape. Something an antagonist might do, but not a villain. You see the difference. As to how or why he was receiving these visions from this creature his entire life, that's not explained. Perhaps Sybok was genuinely a very special Vulcan, one who had tapped into some deeper telepathic abilities that other Vulcans had never previously explored. Regardless, the creature had been imprisoned on the planet for a long time, and although it was powerful, it was certainly no god. The Enterprise transports Spock and McCoy back aboard, but the Klingon ship fires at the Enterprise and damages the transporter immediately afterwards, so Kirk is stranded on the planet. It's at this point, I should say, that there had been an alternative ending planned that involved several Rockmen, but due to budget constraints, it was reduced to just one Rockman. I think the Rockman suit looks absolutely fantastic, if I'm honest. Some test footage has been released on the special edition DVD version of the film. Apparently, there were issues with the suit, and the footage wasn't really working as well as the filmmakers had hoped, so it was dropped. But I think this guy actually looked kinda cool. The Enterprise and the Klingon ship are locked in a standoff, and so Spock convinces the Klingon ambassador to order Captain Kla to stand down. The bird of prey destroys the creature of Shaka-Ree, and Kirk is beamed aboard the ship. It turns out Spock was the one doing the shooting. There's a final gathering aboard the Enterprise in the observation lounge, where everyone has a drink, at the edge of the known universe, because why not? Kla salutes Kirk, and I suppose he would probably be happy enough that Kirk saluted him back, considering he seems like a massive Kirk groupie. It was also probably the honourable thing to do, which any self-respecting Klingon would appreciate. Kirk, Spock and McCoy shoot the breeze, discussing whether God is truly out there. Kirk suggests he's in the human heart, and Spock mourns the passing of his brother Sybok. Kirk says he lost a brother once, but was lucky to get him back, referring of course to Spock's resurrection. Kirk realizes that he'd been wrong. Men like him do have families. His brothers, Spock and McCoy. And so we come full circle with a final scene of the trio once again around the campfire and Spock plucking his Vulcan harp, playing the song Row, Row, Row Your Boat. This time they all sing it. The film ends rather unceremoniously, and the final conclusion is very anticlimactic, making one wonder, what was the point of it all? What exactly is Star Trek V: The Final Frontier trying to say, or what was it trying to explore? There's no clear theme, just several minor and disconnected themes that are hit upon throughout the film. Kirk's mortality, the idea that the three main characters are like a family, Spock's relationship with his half-brother Sybok, Sybok's quest for God, something about people's pain. God is in the human heart, but there's nothing really clear here, and nothing is thoroughly explored. The central plot was generally fairly weak. The antagonist was well written and portrayed, but the story didn't feel cinematic or interesting enough. It's like the film doesn't know what it's trying to say. The idea of potentially meeting God may sound like a big, ambitious concept, but as this is ultimately an unknowable thing, it would only ever come off as unsatisfying to most people. The story just isn't very intelligent or developed enough. Also, the secondary cast members of Scotty, Uhura, Chekhov, and Sulu really don't get much to do. That being said, and I know this is also going to be repeated in the comments below, I'd still find this film more watchable as a Star Trek story than the J.J. Abrams films or any of the subsequent new Trek TV series currently airing. Star Trek V: The Final Frontier isn't a great film, unfortunately, but it is a film I kind of like despite all of its flaws, and that's really the only way you can actually like this film. There are some memorable and humorous scenes, some fun action sequences. Look and Bill puts in a fantastic performance. The campfire scene is really strong. Jerry Goldsmith's musical score is just beautiful. Once you've accepted the film's various imperfections, of which there are many, it remains, in the best way I can describe it, weaker than most Trek films, but still kind of fun and relatively entertaining.